I'd like to give you an assignment this week. I want to give you a task, some homework. I want you to be serious about this, and I'd like to see this happen this week. What I want you to do is I want you to talk to your family. I want you to talk to your friends. Maybe today at lunch. Well, I guess it's potluck, isn't it? We're not going to be out at the restaurants throughout town today. But I suppose you still could talk about this at our potluck lunch. But make it a priority to ask this question. What is the will of God? What is God's will? It's a fascinating question. It's one that's multifaceted. It's one where some scriptures are very explicit and they say this is the will of God, and it tells you what it is. Ask that question. Let that be something that spurs conversation, that spurs maybe study this week. And I want you to report back to me just sort of what you discover, what you talk about. It's fascinating. It's multifaceted. One of the primary teachings of the Bible is the will of God. I mean, that really, you could almost say, like, if someone says, what is the Bible? You could tell them the Bible is God's will. It's his thinking. It's what he wants for mankind. He's revealed himself to us. He's revealed his mind to us, and he's revealed what he wants to us. Jesus often had a condemning statement, a condemning word for people who claimed a standard but made no effort to live it. One example was from what Landon read for us. Why do you call me Lord and not do what I say? Can you imagine the hypocrisy? Can you imagine the incongruent reality of what they're doing? Lord, and then we turn our backs. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? And then he goes on and says, let me give you an illustration. Hearing me and hearing my will and then doing my will is like when a man builds a house on a strong foundation. That when the storms come, nothing moves that house because it was built properly. But if you hear my words and you don't do my will, he says that's like a foolish person who builds their house on sand or an unstable foundation. And so when the storms of life come, that house is destroyed. That's your life. The illustration is teaching about. Well, what about in Matthew? Let me read. I've got a couple verses. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 23 and read one of the most condemning things that Jesus ever said that's recorded for us. Matthew 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples. He's speaking to the crowds and his disciples, but he's talking about the religious leaders. He says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They're changing the way their physical appearance is in order to appear more religious and more righteous. And they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And he continues to rail against the religious elite, the leadership of the day. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, if you keep reading in Matthew chapter 23. In the Bible, there is so much emphasis placed on God's people having the right information, the right doctrine. So much emphasis. is on having the right information, the right heart, and the right actions, the right deeds, the right works. And all of those things you could use in a discussion on talking about what is the will of God. Today, we're talking about being doers of Christianity, doers of the word. Our text is going to be from James chapter 1. And although the overall thesis or the overall point today that I want you to leave here with is this: be a doer of the word. I'm going to express that in 3 parts. All right, so turn to James chapter 1. We'll be in James 1 for the majority of our time. We'll turn out of it just a couple more times, but James chapter 1 is the location for our text and our study. And this has three parts. Part 1, in order to be a doer of the word, right? Part 1 is we have to clean up the landscape of our heart. We must clean up the landscape of our hearts. Let's read a few verses here in James chapter 1. It says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." Folks, I want you to understand this is not simply an instruction about how to have conversation with other people. It applies to our conversations with people. It applies as a general principle. God's will is he wants us to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to be angry. But this is in a context talking about what we're doing with the word. And so there's an element to understanding what he means with our relationship to being ready to listen to God's teaching, being ready to receive and accept the teaching of God, the implanted word. Okay? You can see that when you look at the context of even backing up to verse 18, talking about he brought us forth by the word of truth. And then all the way through this context, he's talking about the word and what we do with it. Be a doer is the point today. Now, he says the anger of man does not achieve, produce, or work the righteousness of God. I don't know what translation you're using today. My version says the anger of man does not produce, but it could be translated as work or achieve the righteousness of God. The anger of man is filthy. All right? The anger of man is a stain from the world, which he talks about down in verse 27, to keep oneself unstained from the world. The anger of man is not the same as the anger of God. It's not the same as even righteous indignation when we're angry over things that pertain to justice or things that pertain to being angry for God or for the state of things. This is the anger of man. This is the irrational, explosive volcano anger. This is the anger that is stubborn. It's rooted in arrogance and pride, and it's rooted in a hard heart. This is not talking about instances of being righteous in your anger. This is just saying the anger of the world does not produce the righteousness of God. I like how the NIV puts it. It puts it this way: for man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. I think the NIV captures and is helpful in understanding the point. God's righteousness is talking about the measure or standard of correctness of how we live our life. The do's and don'ts, the rights versus the wrongs. You see, God's will, he's expressed a standard in his will. There's a righteousness, a right kind of life that we need to live. And he says right off the bat here that you need to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Because watch that anger. The anger of man does not produce the right kind of living that God desires. And if you think about it, what's the attitude behind someone who is not quick to hear? Someone who's not slow to become angry. What's the attitude there? When we think about this whole context, and more of this will be revealed as we keep studying, but it's rooted in pride, it's rooted in arrogance, it's rooted in thinking you know better, and that you don't need to listen, and you don't need to learn because you are already it, or you've already arrived where you need to be, thinking you don't need anything. That's the attitude, thinking nothing applies to you. Why do I need to be interested in listening? And you can see how these are put on both sides, you see. Receive with meekness the implanted word. Is that possible? If you're not quick to hear, if you're not slow to speak, or slow to become angry, do you think there's a meekness in the attitude of someone who's characterized by that? Do you think that they will be ready to receive and accept the word implanted in our hearts? He says, put it all aside. And that's why I say we must clean up the landscape of our hearts. If we are wanting to be pleasing to God, if we are wanting to be doers of the word, you've got to start in the heart. Put it all aside, he says. All the filthiness, all the rampant wickedness. Clean up the stains. Take out the garbage. We had a refrigerator problem this week at our house. You see, after a couple of weeks of being in bed and people bringing us food to eat, there was some stuff in the fridge that didn't get used during a proper time. And let me tell you, every time we opened the refrigerator, we were punched in the face with an incredible strong wafting of disgusting, rotting, acidic, kind of stung your eyes experience. Do you think just buying new produce and putting it in there is going to deal with the problem? Just adding some things into that fridge? No. You see, cleaning up the landscape of our heart requires taking everything out of there and throwing it out and kicking it to the curb and to the garbage. You've got to clean up the landscape of your heart if you want to be a doer of the word. If you can be in a place to receive and accept the implanted word with meekness. Right? Meekness is like humility. Maybe your Bible even says with humility. That's the idea of having a low state of mind, right? Not thinking too highly of yourself. It's not necessarily thinking that you're scum, but it's understanding that you're not better than anyone else. It's understanding that you don't deserve anything. It's understanding that you're at the mercy of God and His grace. And so you're not seeing yourself up here, you're seeing yourself down here, in need of the Word. In need of instruction from God, in need of cleaning up our heart. Humbly receive the implanted word. Why does he say that? Receive it with meekness. Might it be that if you're so full of yourself, there's little room for anything else, especially the word of God? It's got to be connected to the previous expectation of being quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. I'm going to point something out now. I'm not going to, it depends on if I confuse myself or not, but the word hear, quick to hear, in this verse is different from how he uses hear later. In English, it's the same word, hear or hearers. But in the original language, he switches to a different word. So we can almost say in verse 19 that every person is to be quick to listen. And we're going to talk in a moment that there's a difference between being a listener and being someone who hears. You can't receive the word when there is arrogance and filthiness and wickedness in our hearts. Let it become a part of you. Let it teach you and challenge you and stretch you to change you in order that you would produce or achieve the righteousness of God, that you would work the righteous standard of God. So part one about being a doer of the word is cleaning up the landscape of your heart. If you're arrogant, if you're not ready to listen to what God has to say to you, then you can't be in a position to receive with meekness and humility the implanted word, which it's implanted because it starts growing in you and changing your life. But first you have to clean up the landscape of your heart. Part two is we must love being taught by God. We must love being taught by God. Let's read some more of our text. Verse 22. through 25. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. Now, I want to point out something. In the ESV, he has the first illustration of the man who is deceived and deluded. He looks into the mirror and he immediately forgets what he was like. The ESV says that that man intently looks and he immediately forgets and walks away and nothing's changed. But then he compares it to the man who looks into the perfect law. Well, it's interesting because the ESV says intently looks and then looks. But the New American Standard Bible says looks first, of the man who looks and then forgets. But the second man who intently looks. So the NASB switches. So there's nothing really inherent in the original, but we're going to talk about this genuine looking, right? Because that's going to be a big piece of what it is to be a doer of the word. This is someone who really looks, all right? Now, I might use the word intently because my studies are often in the New American Standard Bible. So if I'm praising this intently looking, I'm talking about the man that's blessed because his looking produces change, okay? Hopefully I won't confuse you as we continue going through here. A hearer is not the same as a listener. Let me read a couple of different verses. Back here in Romans chapter 2, verse 13, Paul says, "For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified." Right? Just simply hearing doesn't do anything. And we use the saying, in one ear and out the other. That's someone who hears, but nothing happens, right? It doesn't stay in the brain. You don't think about it. It's not affecting any change. In one ear, out the other. That's the hearer. That's the merely a hearer. But being quick to hear, being someone who hears and then intently looks and then acts or effectively does or works and then is blessed, this is someone who is a listener. And the word changes. Again, verse 19 of James 1, the word could be translated quick to listen. But as he talks about being a merely hearer or only a hearer, it's a different word. And it's translated as to hear, not to listen. Let me give you another verse in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Paul's encouraging this young preacher, and he says, in chapter 4, verse 16, he says, "Keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching." He says, "Persist in this, for by so doing, you will save both yourself and your hearers." That's the same word as in James 1:19. You could almost say, you'll save yourself and those who continue listening to you. I think it's significant that James is using a different word. Being quick to hear is being quick to listen. You're listening because you want to hear what's being said. You're not just in one ear out the other so that then I can start talking and I can get angry. No, this is about being ready to receive and to grow. So there's a difference between a hearer and a listener. And so you have this mirror, right? And he calls this man deluded. And he calls him deceived. But what he does is he goes and he admires himself in the mirror. And then when he turns from the mirror and walks away, it says he immediately forgets what he looked like. And so he sees himself in the mirror, but he doesn't see because he's deluded and he's deceived. These two words are like synonyms. One of them means to mislead. And it's like you're misleading yourself. That's the idea of being deceived. Being deluded is to rationalize or think falsely about something. But you see, you're doing it to yourself. So the reality is your hair looks terrible and you got spinach in your teeth and you look at yourself in the mirror and you walk away and you change nothing about yourself because you're deluded and you're self-deceived. Don't be this man. Because he's being compared to one who hears, but that's it. James is going to say that in verse 26, if anyone thinks that he's religious. See, this man who looks at the mirror like that, he thinks he's religious. He thinks he's attained the standard of God, the righteous standard of God. And he doesn't see anything in his reflection that says you need to make some changes about your life. Because again, arrogance, pride, hard heart, not willing to receive the word implanted to affect change in the life. Deluded, deceived, and then James says he forgets. He forgets. Not interested in truth. Not interested if there's spinach in the teeth. He reasons falsely about himself. Verse 26 says he deceives himself, deceives his own heart. And how is that? How is it that he's deceived his heart? It's because he thinks he's religious. He looks and he likes what he sees. And he thinks that he's already arrived and he is meeting the righteous standard of God. I'm good. I know what I need. I don't need to listen to anyone. That's arrogance, right? And not only that, not only do I not need to listen, but boy, do I have a whole lot to say. There's no bridling of the tongue for him. And it wasn't until I looked at this text for this study that I made the connection between verse 19 and verse 26. Verse 26, the bridling of the tongue just sort of seems like it comes out of nowhere. But don't you see it's tied directly back to verse 19, being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. The one who's blessed, the one who does the word of God, is able to be quick to hear and slow to speak. That's the same thing as bridling the tongue. But the person who looks at the mirror and doesn't see anything wrong with his life and doesn't see any room for improvement, thinks he's religious, well, he's self-deceived. And he's not interested in controlling his tongue. But see, the illustration continues. He doesn't use mirror again, but he talks about this other man who looks into the perfect law. And the New American Standard Bible says intently looks. And it's not two separate original Greek words, it's just one word. And what it really has the meaning of is to stoop down and to examine. That's what the word for looks is in the original. To stoop over and to look at carefully. Here's the difference. This person slows life down to where they stop walking along the path and they stoop over and they examine. And they're looking with the intent for learning. They're looking to grow intellectually as a result of their looking. That's all tied up in the phrase intently looks. But what's he looking into? The perfect law. The law of liberation. The law of liberty. Into the Christian principles, into the word spoken by Jesus, repeated by apostles, and added to through revelation as more and more was said and written of God and from God as his will is revealed in the church. There's more and more. And this man, he stoops over to look. He accepts what he sees in that perfect law. And he abides, or he continues in it. He aligns his life with what he sees because he loves being taught by God. How do you prove yourself a doer? By the way, it's a command in Greek that you prove yourselves doers of the word. Well, he describes what that looks like. You intently look. You abide or persevere in, and then you effectually do, as the New American Standard says, or the ESV says, you then act on it. You see that? How do you prove to be a doer? You're ready to listen. You're ready to intently look and examine, and you are craving being taught of by God. And then you stick around. You don't reject it and turn your back on the truth. You persevere or abide in it. And then the next step is you start doing. So part one was we have to clean up the landscape of our hearts. Part two is we must love being taught of by God or being taught by God. Part three is we must manifest our religion with our lives. And really that's almost synonymous with being a doer, but the way that James teaches it, I think it's appropriate to label it this way. This part three, we must manifest our religion with our lives. Verses 26 and 27. Let's read. He says, if anyone thinks that he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Would you like to know what's worse than being merely a hearer of the word? You know, merely hearing is describing someone, again, who's not quick to listen. But it's someone, it's like more dangerous because they think they're religious and they think they can teach others. So what's worse than someone who's just a hearer is someone who thinks they're religious, who then goes on and tries to teach about which they don't understand. They don't practice themselves. And so now we have a Christian hypocrite going around giving God and the church a black eye in the world in which we live in. The culture is disgusted by people like this. You know it. You've seen it. And people who come in, maybe from the community to churches, and they look around and all they see, that they want to know, do y'all do anything, or do you just sit around and moan and complain about things in life? Do y'all do anything? You see, being just a hearer, you're ready to judge, and you're trying to control people when you open your mouth and you try to speak about things that you don't know about. You haven't even practiced in your life, and you haven't been changed and transformed, and yet you try to open your mouth. That's what's worse than being just merely a hearer. It's someone who thinks they can speak about things which they don't know. And so ministers, and God himself are blasphemed by these kinds of people. Notice the descriptions in the text. Pure and undefiled. It's like the opposites, right? What is pure? Pure is when something's undefiled. What's something that's undefiled? Well, it's pure. So he's just giving us two words to describe the same thing. True religion. Sincere, genuine religion. Religion that meets God's righteousness is, in James's view, what he's emphasizing is a religion that works. It's a religion that does. It's a religion that's full of people who are doers of the word. Isn't it appropriate that he uses two verbs to describe what pure and undefiled religion is in a section on being a doer of the word? What is pure? If we zoom out and think of the whole context, well, what's pure and undefiled? Or rather, let me ask the other question. What is impure and defiled religion? It's the anger of man. It's the filthiness and the wickedness. It's arrogance. It's no control over the tongue. It is listen. It's claiming religiousness without God's righteousness. That's impure and defiled religion. Claiming religiousness without righteousness. And then the opposite, pure religion, is humility. It's someone who's a seeker, a God-pleaser, and a doer. Well, let's look at these two verbs, to visit and to keep. To visit and to keep. So, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction or in their time of distress. So, does that mean all we got to do is once a week or once every couple of weeks go over to their house and talk with them for 10 minutes? Is that pure religion? An undefiled religion? Some people have gotten the idea that that's what it is. And some people make sure that when they hire a preacher, we want to subcontract all of the visiting to the preacher. Is that the preacher's job and the preacher's job only, or should it be the whole church family, all Christians who are engaged in pure, undefiled religion? We all should visit because we're Christians. The preacher should visit because he's a Christian, not because he's the preacher. Now, what does it mean to visit? It's not just about going and talking with people. To visit actually means to supply the need. It means you go to them looking to help them in some way. Not just to talk and visit, as we use that word. In classic Greek, or what I'm trying to say is, where this word comes up in Greek culture outside of the Bible, it's often used when describing nursing someone back to health. Helping someone in their sickness, to visit them. And so to visit orphans and widows would be to visit, go to people in the congregation, go to Christians, go to people that maybe aren't even Christians, because that's still a part of undefiled and pure religion, and help people who have genuine need. Especially people like orphans and widows who don't have their natural family to supply the needs for their life. The second verb is to keep. To keep what? To keep yourself unstained from the world. Well, that could involve a whole lot of things, don't you think? Don't we need to know more of God's will, more of God's standard to understand the stains of the world? In this context, we know that the anger of man is a pretty dark smudge on our character. We've got to clean that up. We've got to keep ourselves unstained from that. But we also know that there's a whole lot more revealed to us in God's word that instructs us about the world and sin and abstaining and keeping ourselves away, keeping our lives away. This morning in Bible class, we talked about some pretty serious sins. And so this instruction would say, hey, keep yourself unstained from all of those kinds of sins. Well, we've looked at 3 different parts to being a doer of the word. Let me review them for you. We must be doers of the word. And what that means is James says, I think you have to clean up the landscape of your heart. You need to love being taught by God. And you need to make sure that your life is in line with your religion. You can't be a hypocrite. You need to be full of action if you're a Christian. We have to ask, I think, this question as we close. If the anger of man doesn't produce the righteousness of God, well, then what does? What is it that produces the righteousness of God? It's not the abuse of the tongue. It's not lack of self-control. It's not delusional thinking. It's not thinking we're righteous or thinking we're religious. Jesus said, why do you call me Lord and not do what I say? Do my daily choices come into play with producing God's righteous standard? Do my priorities in life, do my activities, do my hobbies, do my relationships, am I aligned with the do's and don'ts of Christianity? Am I a humble listener and seeker? Filthiness and wickedness and the anger of man must all be put away in order to receive the word implanted in our hearts. And it's that word that if you allow it to be implanted, if you receive it and accept it and it grows, it will teach us about God's righteousness. Let's strive to do better. Let's strive to be true and genuine and doers of the word. And I sincerely pray that we consider these things.